weapons industry said we require nuclear power as a sort of Trojan horse, camouflage to hide behind. And then everyone said it was safe. The Japanese didn't want nuclear power after Nagasaki and Hiroshima, but they were talked into it.
This is the State Library of Victoria in Melbourne. As it is, I'm not here to borrow a book, but instead to recall a time when this building and its front facade invoked the possibility of a global radiation catastrophe. In 1959, a major Hollywood motion picture was filmed here, starring prominent actors of the day such as Gregory Peck, Ava Gardner and Fred Astaire. On the Beach was a post-apocalyptic story in which there has been a major nuclear war in the Northern Hemisphere. It has released such tremendous radiation that it forces our protagonists to find refuge in southern Australia, since the Northern Hemisphere is inhospitable to human life. The city of Melbourne, this building, and its facade were prominently featured in the film. It was across here that a large white banner was hung declaring, "There is still time, brother," suggesting that the survivors make the most of their time remaining before the radiation inevitably reached Australia to claim their lives. The US Department of Defense refused any cooperation or collaboration with the movie. The US government complained that the film was unrealistic since the expenditure of all the world's nuclear arsenal in 1959 was far too small to make the Northern Hemisphere uninhabitable. Unfortunately, since that era, nuclear weapons and nuclear power plants have proliferated to such an extent as to make a scenario, such as in On the Beach, a much more realistic proposition indeed. What is more, recent events on a beach some 9,000 kilometers north of here in Fukushima, Japan, are threatening to make that piece of science fiction into a nightmarish science fact. The nuclear meltdown crisis in Fukushima is not over. In fact, it has only just started.
We do not expect harmful levels of radiation to reach the West Coast, Hawaii, Alaska, or U.S. territories in the Pacific. Furthermore, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and public health experts do not recommend that people in the United States take precautionary measures beyond staying informed.
The terrible child of the Great Tohoku earthquake and tsunami is a gargantuan and relentless menace that has the potential to claim victims and casualties, not in the mere thousands as the tsunami did. This new menace could be spoken of in millions, if not tens of millions of deaths and casualties in this generation and generations to come. Remarkably, what is accompanying this disaster is an incredible lack of interest from heads of government, the media, and the United Nations. In swamping and overwhelming the defenses of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear facility, owned by Tokyo Electric Power Company, the tsunami gave rise to the much greater and more permanent monstrous spectre of global nuclear contamination. Radiation from Fukushima is still spewing from its reactors, with some potentially even more horrifying twists in the plot to come. Radioactive contamination cannot be readily understood or dealt with in terms easily grasped by the man on the street. It does not alarm our primal survival instincts that normally alert us to danger. Radiation cannot be seen. Radiation cannot be felt or touched. It has no taste, no scent, and no odor. It does not announce itself like an earthquake, or a marauding invader, or an enraged supernatural monster. But once released, radiation can move seamlessly and soundlessly through walls, tarps, and defensive barriers. It seeps into soil and water tables. It is an eager traveler, contemptuous of sovereign boundaries, oceans and continents. By taking to the wind, hitchhiking on far-flung pollen grains, or falling with precipitation. Rather than taking on a terrifying tsunami-like physical force, destroying all in its path until it is exhausted of energy, radiation is an indefatigable and deadly ghost, seemingly absent and invisible, yet omnipresent and irresistible. Once released, its lethality has, in human lifespan terms, a permanent quality, as plutonium has a half-life of 24,100 years. In high doses, radiation can kill and maim in hours. Dispersed, it can patiently lodge itself in a plant, animal, or human host, giving rise to a whole range of death-dealing ailments. If it does not strike dead the original host, it can easily kill or maim the offspring.
If a fetus, a normal, genetically chromosomally normal fetus, is exposed to a tiny bit of plutonium that lodges in its brain, developing brain, it can kill the cell that's going to form the right half of the brain or the left arm. That's called teratogenesis, damage of a normal fetus. It also, plutonium in particular, which is highly mutagenic, lodges in the testicles. It has a predilection for testicles, and it lodges next to the spermatogonia, the cells that form the sperm, the precursors. And it's an alpha emitter, highly mutagenic, so it can mutate genes in the sperm to induce genetic mutations and genetic disease down the generations. And it takes up to 20 generations for recessive mutations to express themselves. So we're talking about eons of time for expression of genetic disease. That's the second thing. The third thing is if the man's got plutonium in his testicles, and every male in the Northern Hemisphere has a tiny load in his gonads from weapons testing days, and plutonium is still falling out. And the man's cremated. The smoke goes out the chimney with the plutonium, so you can breathe it in, another man can, and it's ad infinitum, because plutonium has a half-life of 24,400 years and lasts for a long time. But the other thing is that the body thinks plutonium is iron. It's an iron analogue. So it's stored in the liver, where it causes liver cancer. It's stored in the bone marrow to produce hemoglobin in the red blood cells, but it causes leukemia or bone cancer. It crosses the placenta into the developing embryo, which lets nothing through it, incidentally, except plutonium and a few other nasties. It's stored in the testicle too. So it's a ubiquitous, really dangerous isotope. And from the time they discovered it in the Manhattan Project, they knew its dangers.
In the immediate aftermath of the explosions at the Daiichi nuclear plant, the Japanese government declared its nation safe from nuclear contamination, bar a 30-kilometer exclusion zone surrounding the nuclear plant. Similarly, the United States raised no alarm to its citizens downwind of the nuclear plant. Little or no consideration was given to the possibility of nuclear fallout reaching its shores. On the contrary, the World Health Organization issued a report describing how a number of people had comically poisoned themselves by taking the precaution of taking iodine tablets to protect their thyroid glands from the radioactive iodine they feared would arrive from Fukushima. Major news organizations like CNN, BBC, and Reuters chimed in with a situation normal message, often citing reassurances that the radiation exposure would be no more than that received in a CAT scan. Japanese news platforms chose not to report on the radiation altogether. There were myriad commentaries on how the radiation would never see the shores of North America. As if to reinforce a mirage of safety and to quell any public concerns, there were radiation-positive news items and commentaries. Protagonists on the left and the right sounded the non-alarm regarding the supposedly benign radiation. George Monbiot, writing in The Guardian, stated that his faith in nuclear energy was strengthened in light of Fukushima, and that we needed more nuclear power plants. On the right, Ann Coulter, a conservative American political commentator, declared that radiation is actually beneficial to human health.
There's a growing body of evidence that radiation in excess of what the government says are the minimum amounts you should be exposed to are actually good for you and reduce cases of cancer.
The inexplicable absence of any credible government or multilateral response, or even reasonable coverage from mass media outlets, suggests that these institutions are captured by the international nuclear industry. It seems we the people are alone on this one. There is still time, not to savor before we die, but to speak out and act in order that we and our brethren do not die out. if we act, we may be able to salvage something of our environment and protect our children. If inaction and indifference is to be our response, then we are, for all intents and purposes, no matter where we live across the globe, all standing on Fukushima beach together, waiting for the lethal radiation to take us en masse. We will be judged by our children, one way or another.